tap me when I go too fast. The lonely cowboy who married a mail-order bride the town raffled away. Thompson rode his horse across the endless plains, the wind tugging at the brim of his worn hat. The sky stretched in shades of orange and pink as the sun sank behind the hills. His ranch, a small cluster of wooden buildings surrounded by wide fields, lay behind him, quiet and empty. The cattle were grazing peacefully, and the only sound was the low murmur of the wind and the occasional call of a distant bird. Jed's life was simple. Each day followed the same rhythm: feeding the animals, repairing fences, riding the land, and returning home to a quiet cabin where only his thoughts kept him company. The cowboy had lived like this for years. He had no family nearby, no close friends in town, and no one waiting for him at the end of the day. The townspeople knew him, certainly, but they saw him as a solitary figure who preferred the company of his horse, Dusty, and the wide, open prairie. He was respected for his work ethic and honesty, but conversations beyond hello and good morning were rare. He liked it that way sometimes. There was comfort in the silence and in the predictable patterns of ranch life. But other times, especially during the long, cold nights, loneliness pressed on him like the dark sky above the plains. Jed had a small, practical cabin with a single room, a fireplace, a simple wooden table, and a bed covered with a worn quilt. On the walls hung tools, saddles, and a few pictures of distant relatives he had never met. He often sat by the fire at night, listening to the crackle of the flames, imagining what it would be like to have someone share his life. He had never married, never been in love. The thought of companionship was both comforting and frightening. He didn't know much about women or how to speak to them, and yet, deep down, he longed for someone to sit beside him and watch the sun set over the plains. The town near Jed's ranch was small, no more than a few dozen buildings. Its streets were dusty, and the main square was where people gathered to share news or sell goods. Jed visited the town only when necessary, to buy supplies, sell cattle, or fix equipment. Most townspeople found his quiet, independent nature admirable, but some couldn't resist teasing him. "Jed Thompson," they would say with a grin, "that ranch ain't big enough for your pride and your loneliness." He would smile politely and nod, but inside joke. The words reminded him that the world beyond his ranch saw him as a curiosity, a man alone, without a family, living a life that few truly understood. One late afternoon, as Jed was fixing a broken fence along the edge of his property, a few children from the town ran past, laughing and chasing each other. They stopped briefly, waving at him. "Hello, Mr. Thompson," one called. Jed waved back, smiling slightly. The children ran off, their laughter echoing across the fields. For a moment he felt a pang of longing. He remembered a time when his life had been different, though it had been a long time ago. Friends and neighbors had moved on, families had grown, and Jed had remained in his solitary routine, bound to the land and the life he had chosen, or perhaps the life that had chosen him. As evening approached, Jed made his way back to the cabin. Dusty trotted faithfully beside him, the horse's hooves thudding softly against the earth. Inside, Jed fed the horse and prepared a simple meal for himself: cornbread, beans, and a small portion of meat he had preserved. He ate quietly, listening to the sounds outside. The wind whispered through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. These sounds, though lonely, were comforting. They reminded him that he was not entirely alone. The land was alive, and in its own way, it kept him company. After dinner, Jed settled into his chair near the fireplace, a cup of coffee warming his hands. He took out a small notebook and began to write. Sometimes he wrote letters he would never send, notes about his work, his thoughts, or dreams he could not speak aloud. He wrote about the beauty of the plains at dawn, the quiet satisfaction of a fence finally repaired, the freedom he felt riding across the open land. But tonight, his writing turned inward. He wrote about the longing in his heart, the desire for someone who could share these moments with him, even if it was just sitting in silence together. He did not write about marriage or romance specifically. He did not know much about that, but he wrote about the companionship he lacked, the warmth of having someone there at the end of a long day. Jed's thoughts were interrupted by the faint sound of voices outside the cabin. He looked through the window and saw two townspeople passing by, talking and laughing. They waved at him. "Evening, Jed," one called. Jed nodded, offering a small smile. As they walked on, he couldn't help but overhear snippets of their conversation. They spoke about events in town, about who was married and who was single, and about how unusual it was for someone like him to remain alone. Jed felt a mix of irritation and amusement. He didn't mind the gossip entirely. It reminded him that he still existed in their world, but it also reminded him that his solitude was something others noticed, something they found curious. That night, as the fire burned low, Jed lay on his bed and stared at the wooden beams above him. He thought about the years he had spent on the ranch, about the routines he had mastered, and about the quiet life he had built. He also thought about what he had missed, the companionship, the shared laughter, the simple presence of another person to talk to or lean on. Loneliness was not a new feeling for him, but it had a way of growing heavier when the night was long and quiet. He sighed and closed his eyes, hoping sleep would bring rest and perhaps a brief escape from the thoughts that lingered in the dark. The next morning, Jed rose early, as he always did. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon when he saddled Dusty and rode out to check the cattle. The morning air was crisp, and the prairie seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Jed felt a sense of freedom riding across the land, but even this freedom carried the weight of solitude. There were no friendly voices to greet him, no partner to share the morning's quiet beauty. Only Dusty, faithful as ever, walked beside him, and the wide open plains, vast and unchanging. As the day went on, Jed continued his work, mending fences, tending the cattle, repairing tools. The work was hard but honest. It gave him purpose and kept his mind occupied. Still, during the brief moments of rest, he would glance toward the horizon and imagine what life could be like with someone by his side. Someone who understood the rhythms of the land, who could share in the daily struggles and small victories, someone who could turn the quiet evenings into a shared experience rather than a lonely routine. Jed Thompson's life on the prairie was simple, hard-working, and isolated. It was a life many admired from afar, but few understood fully. He was not unhappy in the sense that he resented his work or the land he loved, but he was aware of a gap in his life, a gap filled by the absence of companionship. And though he often pushed the thought aside, deep inside, he wondered if one day that gap might be filled, if someone might come to share the endless plains, the quiet nights, and the simple joys of a cowboy's life. Until then, he rode, he worked, he wrote, and he lived in the steady rhythm of the land, hoping, in some quiet way, that life might have more to offer than the solitude he had known for so long. Jed Thompson had grown used to the rhythm of his lonely life, but a change was quietly brewing. One morning, as he walked into the small general store in town to buy supplies, he noticed a new flyer pinned to the bulletin board. It was colorful and carefully printed, unlike the usual notes about lost cattle or town events. Jed squinted at the words, "Lonely Men of the West, mail order brides available." He frowned and shook his head. The idea seemed strange, almost impossible. Jed had never considered that people from faraway towns or states might be willing to travel miles just to marry someone they had only met through letters. He wasn't sure whether to laugh or be curious. Yet something about the flyer caught his attention. It spoke of women who were willing to travel west, to live on ranches, and to share the life of men who worked hard but lived alone. Jed's heart, so accustomed to solitude, beat a little faster. The storekeeper noticed Jed staring at the flyer. "Thinking about it, Jed?" he asked with a grin. "Could be just the thing to keep you from talking to Dusty all day." Jed gave a small smile but said nothing. The idea of a companion, someone to share the quiet nights and long days, made him both hopeful and anxious. He wondered if he would even know how to write to a woman, how to introduce himself properly, and how to explain his life on the plains. The thought of leaving his comfort zone, of opening himself to a stranger, felt overwhelming. Yet the loneliness that had been a part of him for so long stirred something he could not ignore. That evening, Jed sat by his fireplace, the flickering flames casting shadows on the walls of his cabin. He took out his notebook and began to write, just as he often did. But this time he wrote letters he could never send, or so he thought. He wrote about his ranch, about Dusty, about the endless fields and skies, and about the daily routines that defined his life. He described the work he did from dawn to dusk, and the satisfaction he felt when the land was well kept and the cattle were safe. He wrote honestly, without embellishment, hoping that somehow, if a woman read these words, she would understand the simple, honest life he lived. Jed also wrote about himself, his fears, his awkwardness, and his longing for companionship. He did not write about love in the way novels or poems described it. Instead, he wrote about sharing his life, someone to talk to, someone who might laugh at his small jokes or sit silently with him while watching the sunset. He felt exposed as he wrote, as though he were letting someone see the deepest corners of his heart. For the first time in years, he imagined life with another person beside him, not as a stranger, but as a friend, a partner, someone who could make the lonely nights brighter. The next day, Jed returned to town, thinking about the flyer. He asked a few neighbors what they thought about mail-order brides. Some laughed, thinking it was a joke, while others shrugged, saying it was a practical solution for men who lived far from towns and women. Jed listened quietly, considering the idea more seriously. He realized that this could be a way to find companionship without leaving the land he loved. But he also worried about how it would look. The townspeople already whispered about his loneliness, and now he would be seeking a wife through letters and advertisements. Would it seem desperate, or would it be understood as a practical choice? As he returned to his ranch, Jed thought about the townspeople's curiosity and gossip. He knew they would notice if he took action. That evening, as he worked on repairing a fence, a neighbor named Mr. Pugh, Harris, rode by. "Evening, Jed," Harris called. "Heard about that mail-order bride business?" Jed hesitated before replying. "I've seen the flyer," he said simply. Harris laughed, a loud, rolling sound. "Well, I think it's a fine idea." "A man like you deserves a companion. Maybe the town should help. Make it a little event, you know?" Jed frowned slightly. He did not understand what Harris meant, but he felt uneasy. Making something as personal as a marriage into a public spectacle seemed wrong. Still, Harris's suggestion planted an idea in the minds of others, and soon the story spread through the town like wildfire. By the next morning, Jed's private thoughts about loneliness and companionship were no longer his alone. The townspeople had started to talk about the lonely cowboy and the bride from afar, speculating about who she might be and what she would be like. Jed tried to ignore the gossip, but it was impossible. He worked quietly on the ranch, But the children from town ran past, giggling and teasing. "Maybe she'll ride a horse faster than you, Jed," one called. Jed smiled politely, shaking his head. He was not used to the attention, and it made him nervous. He wanted a companion, yes, but he did not want a parade of curiosity or judgment to accompany her arrival. The townspeople's playful teasing soon turned into something more serious. They began to suggest ways to make the arrival of a mail-order bride exciting. One morning, as Jed rode into town to check supplies, the mayor approached him. "Jed, we have an idea," the mayor said kindly. "The town wants to make this memorable. What if we hold a raffle to choose the bride for you? It could be fun, and it will guarantee that the woman is willing to come." Jed blinked in disbelief. A raffle? Choosing a bride through luck and public attention? He felt a mix of shock and anxiety. Marriage was personal, intimate, and serious. How could it be a town event? But the mayor's eyes were kind, and he explained that the women willing to be in the raffle were all informed and had consented. They were looking for men in the West who could give them a life of stability and work. It was not just a spectacle, it was a practical solution, though unusual. Jed spent the rest of the day thinking about the mayor's words. He was hesitant, unsure, and nervous about involving others in such a private matter. He worried about embarrassing himself or the woman who might come. But at the same time, the idea of meeting someone, of opening a new chapter in his life, stirred a small spark of hope. The thought that perhaps he would not be alone forever was both frightening and exciting. That night, Jed returned to his cabin and sat by the fire. He looked at Dusty, who was grazing quietly nearby, and whispered, Maybe this is the way." He thought about what life might be like with someone beside him, helping with chores, riding across the plains, sharing meals, and talking about the day's work. The idea of companionship no longer seemed like a dream, but a possibility. Jed began writing letters more seriously. He described his ranch, his daily routines, and the honest work he did. He wrote about Dusty, the wide-open prairie, and the quiet evenings by the fire. But he also wrote about himself, his fears, his awkwardness, and the hope that he might find someone who understood the simplicity of his life. Each word felt like a step into the unknown, but also a step towards something he had secretly longed for. Over the next few weeks, Jed and the townspeople prepared for the raffle. Flyers were posted, letters were exchanged, and the women who wished to participate were informed about the life they would lead. Jed felt nervous, unsure of what to expect, but he also felt a quiet excitement he had not experienced in years. The monotony of ranch life, the endless solitude, had been broken by the possibility of change. Finally, the day of the raffle approached. Jed rode into town early, Dusty walking beside him, feeling both anxious and hopeful. He was still nervous about how the event would be perceived, but he knew it was a chance to meet someone who could change his life. As he arrived, he saw the townspeople gathering, the children laughing, and the women who had agreed to participate. The air was filled with curiosity and anticipation. Jed took a deep breath, holding on to the hope that this unusual method of finding a companion could lead to something genuine. He reminded himself that, despite the unusual circumstances, the most important thing was honesty, respect, and kindness. He did not know who would be chosen or what she would be like, but he was ready to meet her, ready to see if life could finally offer him the companionship he had longed for. And so, as the sun rose higher over the small town and the plains beyond, Jed Thompson prepared for an event that would change his life. A simple, hard-working cowboy, accustomed to solitude and quiet, was about to step into a new chapter, a chapter filled with hope, uncertainty, and the possibility of sharing his world with someone who could understand it and perhaps even love it. Jed Thompson woke before sunrise on the day of the raffle. He lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet sounds of the ranch. The wind moved gently outside and Dusty shifted in the stable. Jed's stomach felt tight, not from hunger, but from nerves. He had faced storms, injured cattle, and hard winters without fear. But today felt different. Today was not about land or animals. It was about people, expectations, and a choice that could change his life forever. He washed, dressed carefully, and put on his cleanest shirt. It was still simple and worn, but he wanted to look respectful. As he saddled Dusty, his hands moved slower than usual. He kept thinking about the town, the people who would be there, and the women whose names would be drawn. These were real people, not ideas on paper. They had hopes, fears, and lives of their own. Jed reminded himself again that everyone involved had agreed, willingly. Still, the weight of responsibility sat heavy on his chest. The ride into town felt longer than usual. As Jed approached, he saw wagons lined up, horses tied to posts, and people gathering near the town hall. The town had not seen this much excitement in a long time. Children ran around laughing and shopkeepers stood outside their doors talking loudly. It felt like a fair day, though no banners or music played. Instead, there was a low buzz of voices filled with curiosity. Jed dismounted and tied Dusty near the hall. Several people waved at him. Some smiled kindly, others looked amused, and a few watched quietly, as if unsure how to react. Jed nodded politely to everyone. He felt exposed, as though his private life had been laid out for all to see. Still, he stood straight and calm. He had agreed to this, and he would face it with dignity. Inside the town hall, wooden benches were arranged in rows. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows. At the front stood a small table with a wooden box placed on top. Inside that box were folded slips of paper, each with a name written carefully. The mayor stood nearby, speaking quietly with a few townspeople. When he noticed Jed, he walked over and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You doing all right, Jed?" the mayor asked. Jed nodded. "I reckon so. That's good," the mayor said. "Remember, this is meant to be fair and respectful. No jokes once it starts." Jed appreciated that. It helped him breathe a little easier. Soon, the hall filled up. The women who had agreed to take part sat together on one side. They were dressed simply, not flashy, each with her own look and posture. Some appeared confident, sitting straight and calm. Others looked nervous, their hands folded tightly in their laps. Jed did not stare, but he noticed their presence. These were not names on paper anymore. They were real people who had traveled far, willing to begin a new life in an unfamiliar place. Jed stood near the wall, unsure where to put himself. A few people came up to him, offering short words of encouragement. "You'll be fine," one said. "Whatever happens, it's brave of you," said another. Jed thanked them quietly. When everyone was seated, the mayor stepped forward and cleared his throat. The room fell silent. "We are gathered here today," the mayor began, "to carry out something unusual, but agreed upon by all involved. This raffle is not a game. It is a way for people seeking partnership and stability to meet in a fair and honest manner. Everyone here has chosen to be part of this." He paused, letting the words settle. "The name drawn will be the person who will continue correspondence with Mr. Thompson, with the intention of marriage, should both sides agree after proper time and understanding." That part surprised some people, and a quiet murmur passed through the room. Jed felt relieved. This was not an instant decision forced upon anyone. There would be time to talk, to learn, to decide together. The mayor lifted the wooden box. "Let us proceed." A young woman from the town stepped forward to draw the name. She reached into the box, stirred the papers, and slowly pulled one out. The sound of paper unfolding seemed loud in the quiet hall. She read the name clearly: Clara Evans. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a woman seated among the group stood up slowly. She was of average height, with calm eyes and a composed expression. She did not smile widely or look frightened. Instead, she took a steady breath and walked forward. Jed felt his heart pound. He looked at her for the first time properly. She moved with confidence, but not pride. Her clothes were neat and practical. There was a quiet strength about her that immediately stood out. The mayor nodded. "Thank you, Clara."
"Mr. Thompson."
Jed stepped forward. The room felt very still as they stood facing each other. He suddenly became aware of his boots on the wooden floor, his hands at his sides, and the many eyes watching them. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson." Her voice was steady and polite. "Good morning," Jed replied. His voice sounded rough to his own ears, but clear enough. The mayor spoke again. "You will have time to talk, to write, and to decide your future together. This town will respect whatever choice you make." That seemed to release the tension in the room. People relaxed, and a few smiles appeared. The mayor thanked everyone and dismissed the gathering. As the crowd began to thin, Jed and Clara remained standing awkwardly near the front. Neither knew what to say next. Finally, Jed cleared his throat. Would you like to sit for a bit?" he asked, gesturing toward an empty bench. Clara nodded. "I would like that." They sat down, leaving a small space between them. For a moment, they simply sat in silence. Then Clara spoke. "I know this is unusual," she said, "but I want you to know I chose to be here. No one forced me." Jed nodded. "I'm glad to hear that. I never wanted anyone to feel pushed into anything." She smiled faintly at that. "That already tells me something about you." Jed felt his shoulders ease slightly. They spoke quietly, not deeply, but honestly. Clara told him she came from a small town where work was scarce and life felt narrow. She wanted a place where effort mattered and where she could build something real. Jed told her about his ranch, the work, and the long days. He did not make it sound easier than it was. "I won't promise comfort," he said, "but I promise fairness and respect. That matters more than comfort." After some time, Clara said she needed rest from her journey. The mayor arranged for her to stay with a family in town for the time being. Before they parted, Jed hesitated. "I'll write," he said. "If that's all right, I'll look forward to it," she replied. As Jed stepped outside, the afternoon sun was warm on his face. The town felt different now, quieter, not because people had left, but because something inside him had shifted. The event he had feared had passed, and instead of embarrassment, he felt a strange calm. He mounted Dusty and began the ride home. The plain stretched out before him, familiar and steady. But now, for the first time in many years, the future felt open. Not certain, not easy, but open. Jed did not know what would come of this. He did not know if Clara would choose to share his life, or if their paths would part. But he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer standing still. He had stepped forward, and that alone felt like a victory. As the sun dipped lower, Jed rode on, carrying with him not answers, but hope. And for a man who had lived so long with silence, that hope felt like a powerful beginning. Clara Evans arrived at Jed Thompson's ranch on a bright, crisp morning. The air smelled of fresh hay and warm earth, and the sunlight sparkled across the fields like tiny golden sparks. Jed stood by the gate, Dusty grazing quietly nearby, and watched as the small carriage pulled up. Clara stepped down gracefully, her eyes wide with curiosity, yet calm with determination. She carried only a small trunk, but in her posture there was a quiet confidence that immediately made Jed feel at ease.
"Good morning, Mr. Thompson," Clara said politely, her voice steady but friendly.
"Good morning," Jed replied, tipping his hat. "Welcome to my ranch." Clara smiled faintly. "It's very different from what I imagined," Jed chuckled. "Most things are different when you're far from home." "Come on, I'll show you around." They walked slowly across the yard, Jed pointing out the cattle, the barn, and the fence lines. Clara asked questions, genuinely curious about each detail. She wanted to know how the cattle were fed, how the land was maintained, and even about Dusty, who trotted beside them with his ears perked. Jed realized that she was not just polite. She wanted to understand his life. That small desire to learn and adapt told him more about her than any words could. The first days were challenging. Clara had never lived on a ranch before, and the work was physically demanding. She learned quickly, though, never complaining. She fetched water, carried feed, and helped mend fences. Jed watched her carefully, sometimes offering advice, sometimes just observing her determination. Slowly, a rhythm developed between them. She worked alongside him in the morning, and by late afternoon they both rested on the porch, looking out at the wide, open plains. At first, conversations were simple and cautious. They spoke about the work, the weather, the cattle. But as days passed, they began to share small personal details. Clara told Jed about her childhood, the chores she had done, and the small joys she had found in her hometown. Jed told her about growing up on the plains, about Dusty, and about the quiet life he had built. There was an awkwardness in their early conversations, but it slowly faded as trust and understanding grew. Jed noticed little things that made him smile. Clara had a habit of humming softly while she worked, a gentle tune that reminded him of long-forgotten songs from his childhood. She was careful and methodical, but not afraid to try new tasks. And when she laughed, a sound that came rarely at first, it brightened even the loneliest corners of the ranch. For Jed, who had spent so long in silence, her presence began to feel natural, as though the ranch had waited all along for someone like her to bring it warmth. Despite the growing ease between them, challenges remained. The work was exhausting, and the prairie could be unforgiving. One afternoon, a sudden thunderstorm rolled across the fields. Dark clouds gathered quickly, lightning flashed, and the wind howled. Jed and Clara rushed to the barn to secure the animals. Cattle were nervous. Dusty pawed the ground, and rain began to fall in heavy sheets. Together they closed gates, tied down hay, and calmed the frightened animals. In the chaos, Clara moved quickly and efficiently, holding a rope and guiding a frightened cow into the shelter. Jed watched her, amazed at her courage and calm under pressure. "You're handling this very well," he said, shouting over the storm. Clara smiled, though soaked and muddy. "I told you I'm willing to learn." By the time the storm passed, they were both drenched, tired, and covered in mud. But there was a quiet satisfaction in the air. Jed felt a warmth he had never known in moments like this. It was not just relief that the animals were safe. It was the realization that they had faced a challenge together and succeeded. For the first time in years, he felt truly connected to another person. As the days turned into weeks, Jed and Clara settled into a routine. They woke with the sun, worked together on the ranch, and shared meals by the small wooden table in the cabin. Evenings were spent in quiet conversation or sitting on the porch, watching the sky change color over the plains. Jed taught Clara to ride Dusty properly, guiding her patiently as she learned to feel the horse's movements. She often laughed at herself, and Jed found himself laughing too, a sound that felt strange, yet comforting, after so many years of silence. Clara, too, learned about Jed. She saw his honesty, his care for the land, and his quiet determination. He was not a man of many words, but his actions spoke volumes. She appreciated his patience, his reliability, and the way he treated every living thing on the ranch with respect. Slowly, admiration grew between them. Not the fiery passion of stories or novels, but a quiet, steady affection rooted in trust and shared effort. Not everything was easy. Some townspeople continued to gossip about the unusual circumstances of their meeting. Occasionally, someone would tease Jed, calling him the cowboy who won a bride in a raffle. At first, this irritated him, and he would frown in discomfort. But Clara's presence changed his perspective. She faced a teasing with grace, never angry or defensive, and even managed to turn some remarks into light-hearted conversation. Jed admired her calm strength and began to see the humor in it himself. One evening, after a long day, they sat by the fireplace with mugs of hot tea. Clara had been sharing stories about her family, and Jed listened intently. He realized that he was beginning to enjoy these moments, not just because she was a companion, but because she brought life into the cabin. Her presence filled the empty spaces he had grown used to, not with noise or chaos, but with warmth and understanding. As winter approached, the days grew shorter and colder. Snow began to dust the plains, and the nights were long and quiet. Jed and Clara worked together to prepare, chopping wood, insulating the cabin, and ensuring the animals were safe. During these long evenings, they shared stories by the fire, laughed at minor mistakes, and reflected on the day's work. Jed noticed a change in himself. He no longer felt the weight of loneliness pressing down. Instead, he felt a sense of companionship, a shared responsibility and comfort in knowing someone cared for the same life he cherished. Clara also adapted remarkably. She learned to ride in cold winds, feed the cattle efficiently, and even mend small equipment with Jed's guidance. He began to rely on her not just as a companion, but as a partner. Their teamwork deepened their bond. Each day, their trust grew. They began to anticipate each other's needs, to understand gestures without words, and to work in harmony. The ranch, once a place of solitude, now felt alive with shared effort and quiet joy. Jed began to notice small signs of affection in Clara. She would leave freshly baked bread on the table, tidy up the cabin without being asked, and sometimes catch him looking thoughtful and smile. He, in turn, found himself bringing her small gifts, a bundle of firewood, a jar of honey from a neighbor, or wildflowers from the fields. Neither spoke much about love directly, but their actions expressed more than words ever could. One afternoon, while riding across the fields, Clara suddenly turned to Jed and said, "I never imagined life could be like this. Hard, yes, but full of meaning." Jed nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "That's the truth of it."
This land, it's not easy, but it gives what you put into it.
She smiled, and it seems we put it in together. Jed realized that he had never felt such a simple, pure kind of happiness. It wasn't the excitement of new romance or the drama of the world beyond the plains. It was steadiness, partnership, and trust, a deep sense that they could face whatever came, side by side. As spring approached, the ranch blossomed with new life. The cattle calved, the fields grew green again, and the plains seemed to stretch endlessly, bright and promising. Jed and Clara had become a team, not just in work, but in life. They learned to laugh together, face challenges together, and share the quiet, beautiful moments that made each day worthwhile. By the time summer arrived, the townspeople noticed the change too. The Raffled bride story became a tale of admiration. People saw Clara's strength, Jed's care, and their partnership in action. What had begun as an unusual arrangement had grown into a genuine, heartfelt connection. The gossip faded, replaced with respect and quiet approval. Jed Thompson, the lonely cowboy, had found a companion who understood him, shared his life, and brought warmth to the cold plains. Clara Evans, the determined young woman who had traveled far from home, had found purpose, belonging, and partnership in a life she had not imagined, but had embraced fully. Together they faced the work, the weather, and the challenges of ranch life, finding joy in the ordinary and extraordinary moments alike. On quiet evenings, they would sit on the porch, looking out at the prairie stretching endlessly before them. Dusty grazed nearby. The wind whispered through the grass, and the sky changed color with the setting sun. Jed and Clara no longer needed many words. Their glances, their shared laughter, and their silent understanding were enough. They had discovered that life was richer when shared, that companionship brought strength, and that love could grow quietly, steadily, and completely, even in the most unexpected of ways. The seasons turned as they always did, and the ranch flourished under Jed and Clara's care. Spring had brought new life to the cattle and fresh green grass to the fields. Summer warmed the plains with golden sunlight, and the long days were filled with hard work, laughter, and quiet reflection. The prairie stretched endlessly around the ranch, but it no longer felt empty. With Clara by his side, Jed felt a fullness he had never known, a sense that his life was no longer just his own, but something shared, meaningful, and enduring. The townspeople noticed the change too. The man who had once been known as the lonely cowboy now walked with a quiet pride, and the woman who had come as a mail-order bride was admired for her strength, determination, and grace. Children waved to them as they passed in town, and neighbors stopped to chat, no longer teasing but offering sincere compliments. Some even admitted that they had doubted the unusual raffle, but seeing the partnership Jed and Clara had built, they were convinced it was meant to be. Life on the ranch was not always easy. Winters were cold and harsh, storms came without warning, and the work was never done. Yet Jed and Clara faced every challenge together. When a blizzard hit in early winter, they rose before dawn to feed the cattle and check the fences. The wind was sharp and the snow threatened to bury the paths, but they moved as a team. Clara guided the cattle calmly, while Jed ensured that every gate and pen was secure. Their trust in each other had grown so strong that they could anticipate each other's actions without words. Each day, their partnership deepened, not through grand gestures, but through steady, shared effort. One evening, after a long day in the snow, they returned to the cabin. The fire was warm, casting a golden glow across the small room. Clara removed her gloves, and Jed brought her a cup of hot tea. They sat close but not crowded, their hands brushing occasionally, a comfort that had grown naturally over time. "It's hard work, but I wouldn't trade it," Clara said softly, her eyes reflecting the firelight. Jed nodded. "I feel the same. I never thought I'd say this, but I don't think I could do it without you." Clara smiled, a quiet, gentle smile that spoke volumes. "You don't have to. That's the point of partnership, isn't it? Doing things together, supporting each other." Jed looked at her and realized how much his life had changed in just a few months. He had gone from being alone, cautious, and uncertain, to having a companion, a friend, and someone he could trust completely. The loneliness that had once pressed on him had vanished, replaced by shared purpose and affection. As the years passed, their bond only strengthened. They shared the daily routines of ranch life, celebrated small victories, and faced hardships side by side. Clara learned to anticipate Jed's needs, and Jed learned to rely on Clara's wisdom and care. Each season brought its own challenges, from dry summers to harsh winters, yet together they found ways to overcome them. The ranch thrived, and so did their partnership. Jed and Clara also found joy in the small, quiet moments. They would rise early to watch the sunrise over the prairie, the sky painted in shades of pink and gold. They shared meals, often simple, but made richer by their companionship. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, listening to the wind in the grass, watching Dusty graze, and enjoying the comfort of being together. These moments, ordinary yet profound, became the heart of their life. Over time, the town grew to respect not just their partnership, but the genuine love and care that had developed between them. People would comment on how well they worked together, how they supported each other, and how their presence seemed to bring life to the ranch and the town. Children would follow them in admiration. Neighbors sought advice on ranch work, and even those who had been skeptical of the raffle came to acknowledge that something remarkable had grown from an unusual beginning. One summer afternoon, Jed and Clara rode across the plains together, the wind tugging at their clothes and Dusty trotting steadily beneath them. They reached a hilltop that overlooked the ranch, the fields and fences stretching to the horizon. Clara looked around, taking in the beauty of the land. "It's more beautiful than I imagined," she said softly. "And it feels full of life, not just land." Jed smiled, his gaze following hers. "It's always been beautiful, but you've made it better. The work, the land, the animals, they've always been part of my life. But now I feel it's truly mine because we share it." Clara reached over and squeezed his hand gently. "And I feel the same. I came here thinking it would be a new start, but it's more than that. It's a place to belong, a life to share, and a partner to trust." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun move across the sky. Jed felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had once thought that his life would always be solitary, shaped only by work and routine. But now he had something far greater: companionship, understanding, and a shared future. As the years rolled on, Jed and Clara continued to face the challenges of ranch life together. They mended fences, tended cattle, and navigated the unpredictable weather. Their teamwork became seamless, and their trust in each other absolute. When new neighbors arrived, or travelers passed through town, they often remarked on the harmony of the ranch. Jed and Clara welcomed advice, shared stories, and offered help, building not just a life together, but a small community around them. One evening, as they sat by the fire after a long day, Clara reflected on their journey.
"It's funny," she said, "how it all began. A raffle, letters, and uncertainty."
"I never imagined it would lead to this." Jed chuckled softly. "Neither did I. I wasn't sure if it would work, but I hoped. And somehow it did." Clara smiled.
Not somehow. It worked because we tried.
"Because we cared? Because we faced it together?" Jed nodded, feeling the truth in her words. Their life had been built on effort, respect, and mutual understanding. It had not been easy, but it had been worth every challenge. And now, a loneliness that had once defined him was gone. He had a home filled with warmth, laughter, and partnership. He had a companion who understood him, shared his life, and strengthened him in ways he had never imagined. As the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple, Jed and Clara stepped outside. Dusty grazed nearby, the prairie stretched endlessly, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of earth and grass. They stood together, side by side, and watched the day fade into night. The world was quiet, but not lonely. The ranch was alive, full of purpose, and filled with the quiet happiness of shared life. Jed reached over and held Clara's hand, their fingers entwined naturally. They did not speak. They did not need to. The connection between them, forged through work, trust, and care, spoke louder than words. In that moment, Jed understood something he had not known before. Life was not just about surviving, or working, or even about hope. Life was about sharing, about partnership, and about finding someone who could walk beside you through storms and sunshine, across endless plains and quiet nights. The town eventually stopped teasing him, and the story of the Raffled bride became something of legend. People told the story not as a joke, but as an example of how patience, honesty, and courage could lead to unexpected happiness. Children listened wide-eyed to tales of the cowboy and the brave woman who had joined him. Neighbors admired their partnership, and travelers passing through often paused to marvel at the ranch, the animals, and the life that had grown there. Jed and Clara continued to work together, live together, and grow together. Each season brought its own challenges, but they faced them side by side. Their life was not perfect. Storms came, cattle got sick, fences broke, but every obstacle was met with shared effort and steady hearts. In the quiet moments, they would smile at each other, recognizing the depth of their connection and the richness of a life built together. Years later, when the children of the town asked about their story, Jed would smile and say, "It started with a simple hope, some letters, and a willingness to try." Life has a way of surprising you if you're ready to meet it with honesty and care, Clara would add. And sometimes what seems unusual at first turns out to be exactly what you needed, not by luck, but by willingness to step forward. Together, on the ranch, the sun rose and set over the endless plains, the wind whispered through the grass, and Dusty grazed quietly nearby. Jed and Clara, side by side, continued their work, their partnership stronger with each passing day. They had discovered that life was richer when shared, that companionship brought meaning, and that true happiness often grew quietly, steadily, and completely in the simple acts of love, care, and understanding. The lonely cowboy was no longer lonely. He had a partner, a friend, and a companion for life. Together, they had turned the unexpected beginning of a town raffle into a lifetime of connection, trust, and joy. A story not of luck, but of courage, partnership, and the quiet power of shared life.